Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
This week, newly elected senators are leading the charge in efforts to repeal unconstitutional abortion laws and to tackle the rising cost of prescription drugs. Plus, the Senate passes a bill to boost funding for rental assistance, and a key panel considers several gun bills. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. It was January 31st when Governor Tim Walz signed into law the Protect Reproductive Options Act, also known as the PRO Act. The law codifies the Minnesota Supreme Court's ruling that guarantees the right to the full spectrum of reproductive care in the state. But laws have been passed over the years that would limit options, and although those laws may not be currently enforced, Senator Erin Maye Quade would like to see them repealed. She joins me now to talk more about it. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Last July, a Ramsey County District Court judge ruled that many of Minnesota's abortion restriction statutes are unconstitutional, including the 24-hour waiting period, parental notification for people under 18 seeking an abortion, and the information that physicians were required to provide to patients. Why is it important to repeal these laws?
I think a really good example of that would be our friends and neighbors to the east, Wisconsin. They have an abortion law that bans all abortions from, I believe, 1849, so before women had the right to vote. That is currently in effect. It's banning abortion. And so we know that until we repeal these laws, a future court could come in and do something different. And we know that if we've passed the PRO Act and we've said that every Minnesotan has the right to make their own reproductive health options, then we need to remove the laws that would get in the way of that.
Regarding laws that some might consider archaic are laws against oral sex, anal sex, premarital sex, and adultery. This bill is primarily focused on repealing abortion restrictions, so why include these?
That's a great question. So I think it's really important to know that every single abortion restriction that has been passed by this state legislature has been struck down as unconstitutional either in 1976, in 1995, or in 2022. And so when we were looking at putting this bill together, we were really putting together a list of unconstitutional laws. And the sodomy, fornication, adultery ones are also unconstitutional. And we thought, why not throw them in? They deal with bodily autonomy, they deal with agency, and let's get this done.
The bill would also repeal the annual report that is currently compiled and published by the Commissioner of Health. The report details a number of data points of those who seek abortion care in Minnesota. Why would you like to see this reporting requirement come to an end?
I really appreciate you asking that question. I think the most important thing to know is that this was not put into place, the reporting requirements were not put into place to provide information to the state to do anything with. It was put into place so that they could provide a criminal felony penalty to providers for not collecting this data from their patients and providing it to the state. So the anti-abortion movement has worked for a very long time to put providers in jail, to threaten them with felony penalties for providing safe, legal care to their patients. And so this was just another tool in that toolbox to criminalize providers and ultimately chill the desire to provide this incredibly basic reproductive health care. And so if you are looking at a felony penalty for not reporting to the state government how many children your patient has, would you want to provide abortion care? And the answer is probably no. And so it was a tool of the anti-abortion movement to criminalize providers and break down trust between patients and providers too, because the amount of information they're collecting is extensive and completely unrelated to abortion care. How much money do you make? How much education have you had? Your marital status, how many children you've had, or how many miscarriages you've had. All of that information has no relevance whatsoever to the procedure you're getting or to the provider who's providing it to you. There is no law that would prohibit public health data from being collected from abortion providers and abortion care patients, and all of the important things that we would need to know about abortion care for public health reasons would still be collected. It just wouldn't be required to be collected from providers under threat of felony and misdemeanor penalties from their patients.
So you're saying that the impetus for the law was more about getting after the providers and not about having demographics on people receiving care. So this also previews a little bit my next question, because in various committees you have repeatedly cited the statistic that 2/3 of people seeking abortion are already parents. So without the reporting requirement that we've just talked about, and maybe that's not where that statistic comes from, But would that be a known fact? Are there important pieces of information that could be lost, or would public health officials still be able to garner that kind of information in another way?
The latter. They would still be able to garner that information in another way. It's important to know that, so for example, I know that the maternal mortality has gone up 60% in the United States in the last 2 years, and it's particularly bad for Black and Indigenous mothers. I know that not because we collect a report and publish it from the state under threat of felony penalties for people who deliver babies, but because that is public health data that is collected. And similarly, we could still collect data about people who have abortions, people who provide abortions for use in public data. The other part is that it's always been the case that about 2/3 of people who have abortions are parents. The statistic could go anywhere from like 63% to 67%. And so that is maybe the statistic that I wouldn't have specific to Minnesota year over year, but about 2/3 is probably what it's going to remain for the foreseeable, well, I don't know how to say for the foreseeable future, because abortion has been banned in so many states that we're going to start seeing some really, we are seeing a public health crisis amongst us right now.
The bill would also repeal the section of law that deals with the treatment of infants born alive after an abortion procedure. Why should this be removed?
That's a really good question. There's been a lot of misinformation shared about this. So it's important to start with the fact that abortion is the termination of a pregnancy for whatever reason. Abortions that happen later in pregnancy are actually, in some complex medical cases, or especially if you're very far along in pregnancy, it's actually just the induction of labor. And so families, the incredibly rare circumstances that these families find themselves in is they, go in, they have an epidural, they induce labor, and they choose to hold their children before they pass away from lethal fetal anomalies or whatever. There's medically complex scenarios. And so what this law does not change the way in which people are treated in that situation. What it does require is providers to provide the intimate details, the APGAR scores of these infants and the specific things that the parents decided to do, whether it was comfort care or perinatal hospice or all of these things, in a report. There's between 0 and 3 families a year who find themselves in these situations, and then we have published their incredibly harrowing, vulnerable details in a public report. So it is not needed. The standard of care for patients, for babies, always remains, right? The people who provide abortion care are the same people who provide labor and delivery. They're the same people. And there's nothing that people who help people have babies want more than to see healthy pregnancies, arrive at a healthy birth. That's just not the case for every family. And it's actually, what this law was also intended to do was to bolster false claims that the anti-abortion movement has made over decades of a thing that, so they created a definition of a thing that doesn't happen, and then they created a law about that thing, and then put in a definition of a thing that does happen so that they can point to a report and say, look, people are having abortions, but they survive. And ignoring the fact that if a child is born alive from a termination of a pregnancy, it's the induction of labor for a complex medical reason, usually for a lethal fetal anomaly, and usually so those parents can hold that child alive before it passes away.
2 other items to be repealed are the requirement that abortions be performed by physicians and the requirement that facilities be regulated by the Department of Health. What's the rationale for these changes?
And so both of those provisions have already been struck down as unconstitutional. So they're not things that are currently happening in the state of Minnesota. Taking the physician-only part, so abortion care is incredibly safe. It is safer than having a tooth extracted. It's safer than having a colonoscopy. Medication abortion is safer than over-the-counter Tylenol or Viagra. And so the anti-abortion movement has really worked to say only medical doctors can provide abortion care when it's actually within the scope of nurse midwives and nurse practitioners and a whole host of medical providers. And in other states, they do provide that care, especially when it involves dispensing 2 pills. That is something a physician's assistant can do and a DO can do. And so it really was just meant to limit the pool of people who can provide abortion care, treat abortion care differently than all other health care, put felony penalties over their heads, right? And so when you do all of those things, you have fewer and fewer and fewer people. Because the goal is to ban abortion for the anti-abortion movement and make it completely out of reach of anybody. And so the reason to repeal that law is because A, it's unconstitutional, B, it harms patients and providers, and C, the more people that can provide reproductive health care, the better.
And finally, briefly before we have to go, opponents of the bill are saying it's extreme. They're saying that some of these laws are meant to protect women or protect the unborn, that there need to be guardrails. How do you respond?
The first thing I'll say is pregnant people are the guardrails. To assert that pregnant people don't know their bodies and their lives and can't make decisions in consultation with their doctors is quite frankly offensive. But what is extreme is using the government to force people to give birth, to try to legislate specific medical procedures in circumstances that they have no idea about. That is incredibly extreme. Making sure that we restore abortion care to being treated like all other health care is exactly what we should do in Minnesota.
Senator Erin Maye Quade, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
With bipartisan support, the Senate approved a measure that boosts funding to prevent homelessness.
48% of renters in Minnesota are cost burdened. That means paying more than 30% of their income on rent. 24% of Minnesota renters are severely cost burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on rent. That's 590,000 Minnesota families at risk of having to choose between a home and other basic needs like food or medicine. These pressures lead to eviction and homelessness. In 2023, evictions are up 65% over pre-pandemic averages. This is not a catch-up in our court system. This is the new normal. And this is not just affecting adults in Minnesota. On a given night in January, 7,232 children were homeless with their families. Another 1,659 children were homeless with no adult. 297,000 Minnesota children live in cost-burdened homes.
The state needs to do what it can to deregulate and help us increase the supply of affordable housing across the state, both in the metro and in greater Minnesota, to help families and folks like this in need. And we also need to do what we can to encourage folks to become homeowners in this state. We know that the ability to buy a home can lead to generational wealth, which will help families for many generations to come. So while I appreciate this measure and the help it's going to provide folks here in the near future, in the near term, I hope we continue to do the work across Minnesota to, number one, increase our housing inventory for folks and also continue to make it affordable. We have to move in that direction in policies that are going to lower the cost of housing, not increase it or potentially exacerbate the shortage of inventory that we have. And so I'm encouraged by this bill, but hope that some of that more long-term work that will help people for generations to come will still continue. Thank you.
And Senate Republicans, who declined to support a bonding bill last week, made an offer to support the bill in exchange for increased funding for tax relief, long-term care, and agriculture.
What we're proposing is that we take that $2.3 billion that Senate Democrats and the House and the governor have reserved for an all-cash bonding bill. We said, okay, what we could do with that then is turn part of that into a GO bond, that's a general obligation bond, free up cash that would give continuing tax relief to Minnesotans through Social Security tax relief. We want to see a commitment that there would be no taxes raised on Minnesotans. What we'd also do is that would free up money for long-term care facilities. So we'd put that in Human Service Committee, their target. So long-term care and nursing home care that people have been crying out for. This is a shared priority that we think Democrats and Minnesotans can get behind.
Minnesotans who created this surplus want that money back, and we want to get them a bonding bill, but we also want to get the tax relief.
Senate Republicans aren't here to just sit in our chairs and vote no. We really do want to work and try to pull this thing together so that we can come to a bipartisan agreement.
We can have a bonding bill and we can have tax relief for Minnesotans. And as well as that, we can start to stem the tide of closing nursing homes. We can meet the needs of our agricultural industry.
According to the Minnesota Department of Health, list prices for many prescription drugs are growing significantly faster than the rate of inflation. Physician and Senator Kelly Morrison is sponsoring a bill that would prohibit excessive price increases for some medicines. She's also the Senate author of the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, and she joins me now to talk about both measures. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
As a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist, I would imagine that you have firsthand knowledge of the challenges that face both patients and physicians when it comes to the affordability of needed medicines. Is that right?
That's absolutely true. You know, we see it every day in our practice that patients who struggle to afford the medicines that they need, either to maintain their health and in some cases to survive. You'll recall the story of Alex Smith, who died rationing his insulin as a 26-year-old young man several years ago, which led to, it really heightened everyone's knowledge, I think, about the prescription drug affordability problem that we have in this country. And most of us experience it in our own lives and our own families, but I certainly see it as a physician. It's very frustrating when a patient is trying to manage their health and they can't simply because they cannot afford it.
Your bill then, Senate File 168, would prohibit excessive price increases by manufacturers of generic or off-patent drugs. So is this essentially an anti-price gouging law that is limited to generic drugs?
Well, this bill is a combination of two initiatives. I carried the Prescription Drug Affordability Act when I was in the House the last 4 years, and it's combined now with this anti-price gouging bill. Both were recommendations of the that came out of the Attorney General's bipartisan task force that looked into the prescription drug affordability challenge. So the bill does two things. One, it doesn't prevent price increases, but it does give the Attorney General authority to look into generics and off-patent drugs that exceed certain thresholds when the price increases by 15% over a calendar year or by 40% over the previous 3 calendar years. And the Prescription Drug Affordability Board is a board that looks into drugs that are priced excessively. In other words, they hit certain triggers, and then the board is empowered to investigate those prices to see if they create an affordability challenge for patients or the healthcare system. And then if they do, to set an upper price limit to make those medicines affordable for patients and the system.
So in terms of the generic off-patent drugs, then this board would note that the price increased beyond a certain amount, and then the Attorney General would be empowered to investigate?
Well, that would be the price gouging part of the bill, and that's directed at generics and off-patent drugs because of the complex patent system that has protected a lot of the brand name drugs. So we're unable to go after those drugs. So and this is just aimed at those drugs that really go above and beyond in terms of some of the price increases are kind of eye-popping. And so that they're related but sort of separate but under the same bill. So the Affordability Board can look at all drug prices. Okay, so the Prescription Drug Affordability Board has been established in 7 other states. There are other states that are considering it. Yep.
Then there's a Drug Affordability Advisory Council.
That's right.
And so just one more time, kind of explain the difference between these two.
Sure. So the Affordability Board is a 7-member board appointed by the governor with staggered terms. The Advisory Council is a council of advisors to the board. So I've put people from all different parts of the drug supply chain on that board. So we have wholesalers, we have people from pharmaceutical companies, we have manufacturers, we have into health plans, we have patients with lived experience, and we have healthcare economists. So people with expertise in our complicated pharmaceutical supply chain to advise the board when they're making decisions about setting an upper price limit and if that's necessary. So this isn't an automatic thing for all drugs. This is just drugs that exceed certain triggers. And then even then, it's not for certain that an upper payment limit will be set, but the board is empowered to decide if it should with the advice of this expert advisory council.
And this is just pointing out how complicated the pricing is in our healthcare system. There is a paid advertisement by pharma that is appearing in some of the daily newsletters that I read, and it blames the price hikes on insurance companies and pharmacy benefit managers, What's your view of the interplay of all these moving parts?
Yeah, well, it's one of the frustrating things about the pharmaceutical supply chain is you'll see a lot of these different players pointing fingers at each other, and it's so complicated that I think there are ways in which they can sometimes get away with raising prices unnecessarily. So I think part of the great thing about the Prescription Drug Affordability Board is this upper price limit pushes it through the supply chain. So it applies to every player along the supply chain. It's not just targeting the manufacturers, although it starts with them because they set that wholesale acquisition cost at the very beginning. So it's a complex system. But really the point is we need to find ways, and the fact that there are now 7 across the country and a growing number of states are considering implementing them as well. This is a crisis, and there's this growing recognition and this growing understanding that we need to get better control of it. Drug prices and pharmaceuticals they're a public good. They're different than other consumer products. If someone needs this medicine to survive or to thrive, that's different than, shopping for a new TV or a new phone or a new product of some kind. This is a public good. This is about our well-being.
Is there any concern, though, that if profits then ultimately become limited by the ability to increase prices by manufacturers, that it could lead to shortages of some drugs that are needed because manufacturers just won't want to gamble with the manufacturing?
I think that's a fair question, and I think that it's important to say, too, that this is not an attack on the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry has created some incredible breakthroughs and continue to, sometimes with help from NIH grants and publicly funded research. I think it's important to note. Ask me the question again. I lost my train of thought.
Oh, the question was about manufacturing and
scarcity.
the profit margin that they require to make these drugs.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable industries in the world. So there have been a bunch of studies that have shown that if their profits decreased by 11% or 15%, they'd still be the most profitable industry. So there's a lot of room, and you'll note, and you have noticed, that they're spending a lot of money on advertising and lobbying at the Capitol. They recently took out a full-page color ad in the Star Tribune targeting this bill. So we've never seen a pharmaceutical reform that the pharmaceutical industry hasn't attacked or tried to bring down. So we anticipate that. That's sort of a part of this. But there's a lot of room for this pharmaceutical industry to continue to be very profitable, but also be able to create a product that's affordable to people and patients.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you about one other bill that you were a sponsor of. The Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, House File 366, which did pass in the House recently and will likely come before the full Senate. The intent of the bill is to protect reproductive health care providers and out-of-state patients from legal actions in other states where abortion care has been restricted or outlawed. Why is it necessary?
Well, in the wake of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it's really thrown our country into I hate to overuse the term, but really a public health crisis in terms of maternal morbidity and mortality. We've seen very restrictive reproductive health care laws crop up across the country since that decision came down. And here in Minnesota, we are holding firm that people have the right to access the reproductive health care that they need. So in this new and ever-changing legal landscape, we need to make sure that people who come to Minnesota for refuge and care and the people who take care of them within the borders of Minnesota are protected from laws in other states that specifically target reproductive health care that's legal here in Minnesota. So that's why it's so important that we pass that bill here in Minnesota.
Senator Kelly Morrison, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
The Senate Health and Human Services Committee took testimony on a bill that would fund diapers for families in need.
1 out of every 3 Minnesota families cannot afford enough diapers for their children 3 and under. 1 out of every 3. And that has impacts in terms of health for our little ones, also in terms of mental health for parents. A recent study published in Health Equity found that diaper need is a recognized public health issue that is associated with poverty, food insecurity, and chronic illness.
To make ends meet, many parents reuse soiled diapers or use household items such as t-shirts, paper towels, even plastic bags to cover their baby's bottoms. Not surprisingly, this lack of clean diapers can lead to health risks for children, such as severe diaper rash and infections.
Many of those same families who struggle to keep food on the table do not have the funds to buy diapers. The Diaper Bank of Minnesota has provided 18,000 diapers and 37,000 wipes to Division of Indian Work in 2022. This was not enough to meet the critical hygiene needs of our families. We also received donations from churches, individuals, and we purchased diapers to supplement this need. Many of our families live in rural Minnesota, where it has been hard to make it into the next town. Many families have to make choices whether to buy diapers or to use other means.
And the Senate Judiciary Committee considered a measure to require background checks on all firearms transfers.
Gun violence destroys lives, ends lives, destroys families, traumatizes communities. And has people often living in fear. The standards here are intended to expand the due process available to those who are denied applications, also to give law enforcement the necessary tools to find and determine and thereby screen out those who cannot lawfully possess firearms in Minnesota.
Current law here in Minnesota has a loophole that allows handgun and semi-automatic military assault rifle sales at gun shows, private transactions, and online purchases to happen without a background check, while other sales do require background checks. We feel strongly that requiring a criminal background check on all sales and transfers will prevent at least some firearms from going to individuals who are not legally allowed to possess them.
Universal background checks haven't saved a single life or lessened crime in any state they've been passed in. I could talk about how the Parkland, Florida shooter, the Sutherland Springs church shooter, the Las Vegas shooter, Orlando nightclub shooter, Charleston, South Carolina church shooter, the Chattanooga recruitment station shooter, the Fort Hood shooter, the second Fort Hood shooter, the San Bernardino shooter, the Aurora, Colorado shooter, Newtown, Connecticut, and Gabby Giffords shooter, and on it goes, all passed background checks or completely circumvented the background check system before using a firearm to go on a killing spree.
Using this bill to focus on basically law-abiding citizen transactions, I consider to be an overreach. I believe many of the people that are here today that are concerned about the legislation sees it as a step, an incremental step to eventually denying rights that are outlined in our Constitution.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.